1990s, in the seaside town of Port Elizabeth, South Africa, serial killer Stuart Vilken hunted. Unusually, he murdered individuals from two distinct groups, both female prostitutes and young boys. He would even go on to kill his own daughter. He terrorized the city, transitioning out of the oppressive apartheid system, displaying dark urges that would be experienced only by an unlucky few, those who had the misfortune to cross the path of the killer, known as Boetie Boer.
Okay, so Stuart Vilken was found guilty of 9 counts of murder, 4 counts of sodomy, which in today would be considered rape under the new Sexual Offences Act. And he also committed necrophilia as well as cannibalism. So he kind of encompassed all the worst of the worst of serial murder offenders.
Vilken killed from 1990 until he was arrested in January of 1997. He was active in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. But what happened in Vilken's life that led him to become a serial killer?
So he was essentially abandoned by his mother, and then was taken in by a family who the father was particularly abusive. Actually, from all accounts, it sounded extremely abusive, to the point where I think it was a neighbor or someone who saw what was going on then decided to take him in. And from there was continuous trouble and dysfunction, I think, that occurred to him, as well as how he also behaved growing up.
What you find in Stuart Vilken's case is there is a combination of physical and emotional abuse, query sexual abuse, but I think it does stand to reason that the more diverse the types of abuse, the more likely it is that will damage a child severely. So what happens is that often in cases of abuse, and when you're getting burnt with a cigarette, made to eat the dog food, as Stuart Vilken claimed, because in that situation, because of his age, and perhaps a protectiveness over his sister, we're not sure what the dynamics there were, he almost feels compelled to survive in that environment, which means tolerating whatever he's subjected to, because his belief is that if he doesn't, that will, he will be on the streets and won't be able to survive. His survival will be compromised. But what also happens is that psychologically, he begins to believe that he has to rely on these people to survive psychologically. And what you do find in victims of abuse is that in order to tolerate that kind of situation, they will believe that they are to blame in some way for the abuse, and that the abusers are good and actually mean well. So it sort of twists and skews one's perception of the world and behaviors. And that would have left him feeling very bad about himself, very low self-esteem, feeling shamed and humiliated, and very bad fundamentally. What abuse also does is it really evokes tremendous rage in the victim of abuse, but there's often limited or no opportunities to express that rage towards one's abuser. So that either gets suppressed and builds up, or has to be expressed in alternative channels.
Having been abandoned as a child and suffering terrible abuse at the hands of adults in his life, it is no surprise that the young Vilken would suffer lasting psychological effects. His early life, including alleged sexual abuse, would shape his personality and ultimately influence his supremely antisocial behavior. Dark fantasies were indeed ignited in the mind of a young man on the fringes of society. But could Vilken blame his horrific crimes on the horrors of his youth?
I'm sure it led to a lot of pathological and dysfunctional thinking, and would have definitely created a lot of trauma. But did that lead him to killing people? No, I don't think we can necessarily say that, especially because there are many other people who go through horrific circumstances and incidents and don't end up committing such acts and violent crimes and that sort of thing. So we can't say he became a serial murder offender because he was abused. I think that would have definitely had an impact on him, but doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, he may have been raised with his biological family and may have still turned out this way as well. So I don't think we can blame it on his abuse.
I think when someone like Stuart Wilkin then enters adolescence, where developmentally the normal tasks are to establish identity, to consolidate peer relationships, and to start exploring one's sexuality, he would have carried in all the remnants of his earlier childhood into that phase. So he would have come in feeling inadequate. He would have come in feeling very shameful about who he was, and that may have made him very vulnerable to being bullied by his peers, because they would have recognized that, or he would have behaved in a way that would have indicated that he was an easy target. If one is sexually abused at a young age, and with Stuart Wilkin, in terms of how he describes having been sexually abused, what that does is it does evoke considerable shame and a sense of badness, because again, if this happens when one is a child, one believes that they were responsible in some way for what happened, especially if the abuser is in a position of power or authority. Stuart Wilkin, he spoke about a pastor doing it, and might have been quite well regarded in the community. So one feels one cannot disclose, so one feels alone, ashamed, and it sort of compounds a sense of sort of internal being really bad in some way. What it also does then in terms of development of sexuality is that this then becomes precocious. So sex also becomes associated with being exploitative, ambivalence around sex, because frequently victims of abuse may even enjoy the sexual act because of the physical pleasure, but it's invasive and intrusive in some way. So in that sense, sex becomes framed in that way for the individual, for the victim of abuse, and they will carry that through into their relationships in adulthood. But what it can also become is a means by which they regulate their emotions. So sex becomes an outlet, sex becomes a way of expressing anger, a way of overcoming the humiliation, so it can get confounded in that way as well.
Wilkin's first confirmed victim was murdered in February 1990. He was 15-year-old Montefico, a homeless child. Wilkin sodomized the boy at Cilliers Secondary School in Sydenham, strangling him to death. Wilkin, of course, did not stop there. Having now enacted one of his fantasies, what would continue to motivate him to kill? And why did he seek out young boys, and later also female sex workers?
The fact that Stuart Wilkin's first victim is a 16-year-old male would speak to some of the dynamics that we've discussed in understanding him. So first of all, when serial killers or murderers look to choose their victims, it's really about vulnerability, desirability, and availability. So if we look at a 16-year-old, they would, given the age difference, that would have made this person vulnerable. They may have been quite suggestible or trusting. So, there may have been availability to it. So from that point of view, it's almost a very pragmatic approach by Stuart Wilkin, where he can overpower this person easily. But why a male is really, and a child, literally, is because I think in some way, part of this is envy. So there may have been a sense of him wanting to destroy that which he was deprived of, which may have been innocence, opportunity, whatever he projected onto that victim. And then to sort of say that it was an attempt to attack God, so to speak, because God had deserted him in his hour of need, is interesting, because you do find serial killers can murder from ideological perspectives, and as we see with serial killers is a repetitive cycle where the impetus to carry on doing this, because you can never really achieve that which you set out to do, which is to ultimately avenge and take vengeance out on your original.
Because I know that he also would say certain things like I think he told his victims, some of the young male victims, that he will be the one to kind of introduce them to it, so that they don't, or he also murdered them to take them away from the suffering and the pain that he went through. And then in terms of the sex workers, it's interesting because I think that he also referred to as his biological mother as, he used a more sort of crude term, but as a sex worker, because who leaves her children like that? And then he also attributed his ex-wife to being a sex worker, and how she would be, being promiscuous, and that could maybe be how we could not make sense, but maybe understand where the two different sort of dynamics come from, or two different target victimologies come from.
With Stuart Wilkin, his fantasy was largely predicated on rage. So it was really about having power over and inflicting pain and damage on his victim. Yes, there was a sexual aspect, but it wasn't his predominant motivation. He may have got gratification and sexual release, especially if he felt quite inadequate in that area based on his past experiences. So he was able to enact that, but largely it was really about his immense rage towards women, and according to his account, it was largely directed at his mother, who had abandoned him. But I imagine he'd had many women in his life who had failed him, and we don't know of experiences, perhaps in his adolescence, where some of his bullying did involve rejection by females.
Wilkin killed 5 adolescent children. His modus operandi included strangulation during sexual intercourse, a very personal and intimate display of power. He later claimed that he was saving his victims from going through the abuse that he went through as a child. But why did Wilkin kill his own daughter, who he proclaimed to love? How did he justify this ultimate act of betrayal?
So that was particularly fascinating because of the way that you could see how he, in his distorted and dysfunctional thinking, how he justified what he'd done. The fact that he said that he checked to see that if she had been sexually assaulted or raped. I mean, obviously there's so many questions as to how that is in any way appropriate to be doing, and then how he justified saying that he didn't want her to go through the same things that he went through, and he wanted to take her out of sort of pain and suffering. I found that very, obviously that sounds like a lot of justification there, a lot of rationalizing, and it may have also just been his own sexual fantasies that he was playing out with his own daughter, but not wanting to actually come forward and say that, to try and make it sound like he's being this protective father, which maybe he even in his dysfunction believed himself.
So if we talk about the projection and the envy that might have been in operation with him, where he felt envious of children who may have had better experiences than he did, or nurturing or loving homes, or perception of that, there would have been more of an ambivalence perhaps towards these victims, where he might have felt more, I can't say remorse, because these individuals are not really capable of that, but there may have been a sense of ambivalence in him, which would have made him take more care of his child victims in terms of burying them, and then in a very warped sense, they might have had a more special place in his heart, which is why he sort of would go back and reenact things with them.
Wilkin kept his daughter's body hidden, revisiting the corpse and laying with her at night until she decomposed to a point where he ultimately buried her. Similarly, Wilkin played out his twisted fantasies on the young boys he had murdered. Again, he would hide the bodies so that he could return to them and continue to commit necrophilia on their corpses for weeks post-mortem.
Holmes and Holmes, they said that there's a power and control murderer. So they kill to symbolize their power and control on their victims. So killing for them is a way of regaining control of their fractured mind and personality. And so in terms of that fractured mind and personality, that's also how we could maybe attribute the younger victims for what he had experienced when he was younger with the male victims, and then also then the the sex workers which he experienced or attributed to his mother and his ex-wife. But in terms of necrophilia, necrophilia is basically the attraction to a sexual attraction to corpses. He's admitted to the fact that he would go back to corpses. He even had plans of how he would have sex with the corpses by inserting tissue paper or whatever it was, that so the maggots couldn't get inside. You know, there was the necrophilia is that attraction to, and sexual attraction to dead bodies, and I find it probably unlikely that that did not occur with his daughter, just based on his pattern of behavior that he experienced. I think he also said he laid her clothes out at some point as well, and I can only think that that would also possibly be him reenacting the fantasies as well, or his fantasy that he may have had.
Wilken was, and still is, one of the most complicated serial killers South Africa has seen. His victim types included young boys, female prostitutes, and even his own daughter. Wilken did not only sodomize and kill his victims, his perverse urges led him to become a necrophiliac. And in one case, he cannibalized parts of his female victims' sexual organs.
In terms of cannibalism, with certain serial murderers, there is that element. Now, some of it might be as part of a psychotic process, but in Stuart Wilken's case, that doesn't seem to have been the case with him. But it's really about trying to defile the body sometimes, in terms of humiliating the victim even further in death. But it can be around really almost a primitive urge to incorporate that victim in some way, to take them in, and to deprive them really of the ultimate power or that they might have had in life.
Cannibalism is also known as anthropophagy, which is the eating of human flesh. So to my knowledge, he only ate one victim's flesh, and I think that was more out of a sort of a curiosity, like, you know, what does it taste like, and maybe it was also part of the mutilation that he also did as well. But to my knowledge, I don't think he committed it after that. So that was maybe, excuse the pun, a taste of it, and then he figured out that wasn't really for him.
Wilken had a very fractured past, with a high degree of anger and rage evident in his crimes. He showed no remorse during his capture and trial, even proclaiming that he had been saving his victims from their troubled lives. Wilken played the role of victim and killer very well. Certainly a psychopath, Wilken's acts displayed a complex array of psychological issues.
Sure, I mean, I think Stuart Wilken as a murderer is similar to who Stuart Wilken was as a man in many ways, and it was a composite of his experiences along the way. I think Stuart Wilken felt deeply inadequate, did not have a clearly defined sense of self. So I think he was quite fragmented in different ways, and that we do find in victims of sort of early chronic developmental trauma, and was enacting these in different ways in the way that he killed. And I think once he started to get attention, it was, you know, it was what he'd been seeking his whole life, really, an acknowledgement for potency in some way, you know, even if it was in this extreme way. But I also think that he, you know, I think given, you know, in many ways Stuart Wilken is one of our first in South Africa, or one of our early serial murderers that we know of. And I guess he would have reveled in that novelty too, and being able to command the media's attention in the way that he did, and finally get the affirmation he'd been searching for. So, yeah, I think that would sum him up for me.
And so we find that that's quite a lot with what we call criminal thinking. It's that the rationalization, the justifying why it's okay they did what they did, it's minimizing. So, and that's sort of an aspect as to, I think, what Stuart Wilken did, especially with his daughter, minimizing. You know, it was like he he was looking after her. It was, you know, him distancing maybe the actual true nature of his intentions and motivations with that crime. We get that confusion between wants versus needs, where it's like, I need to have sex, or I need to go kill someone, instead of going, actually, I want sex, or I want to go and kill someone. Then it's that victim stance of all these awful things happen to me, which can then also build that sense of entitlement of then they can just go out and take whatever they feel that is entitled to them.
From rape to murder, necrophilia, and cannibalism, Wilken would stop at nothing to enact his darkest urges. Boedibor was ultimately sentenced to 7 life sentences, and had the death penalty been in place in South Africa at the time, he would certainly have faced the gallows. That said, in South Africa, there is no incarceration without parole, and so Wilken is now eligible to be considered for release. But should that ever happen? And can he be rehabilitated?
Really, he needs to be contained, and society will need to be kept safe, because psychotherapy will not work. I mean, the key goals in rehabilitation from a psychotherapeutic aspect are to access empathy, to develop insight, to learn from consequences, to experience remorse, and those are all factors which fundamentally are missing from Stuart Wilken's makeup. So you cannot make progress that way. So unfortunately, he really needs to be contained and restricted.
Just sad case for, I think, every single person involved. Even the fact that he had someone who essentially tried to save him when he was growing up. There was someone who really did, I think, have good intentions of they wanted to give him a better life, and he still turned into someone who could do such horrific acts. And then once again, that victim mentality, I think, also stood out for me a lot. It was just a lack of insight into his own behavior and how he is obviously playing into certain dynamics, or most of the dynamics. I hope he's never let out. I really do hope he is never let out, because the mind boggles at how this would have stopped, and I'm sure there's a lot of things that are probably going on in the correctional facility that other people are probably being taken advantage of. Obviously we don't know, but we just, I think, need to hope that he is never released. Also, what support system does he have? How would he ever be able to support himself financially by getting a job? Would you ever hire someone who has committed necrophilia, cannibalism? So the realistic, even if by some miracle he has been rehabilitated, how is he going to be able to actually function in society if he is ever released?